Introducing YouTube memberships, a fun way to support the channel while getting some exclusive perks. Click the join button to become a member now and get benefits like badges next to your name on videos, behind-the-scenes photos, advantages during the live trivia game, discounts on merchandise, private one-on-one video chats, the ability to request future video topics, and exclusive 8 to 10 minute videos on the history of the NFL. And now, on with our feature presentation. The 1984 Green Bay Packers got off to an absolutely terrible start to their season. When former player Forrest Gregg came in and assumed the head coaching position following a highly successful stint with the Cincinnati Bengals, which you can learn more about by clicking the card in the upper right corner, I'd have to think that there were much higher expectations than, well, whatever the heck transpired at the start of the season, where through the first 7 games of the year, the Packers were the laughingstock of football, and found themselves at the cellar of the NFC with a 1-6 record, a far cry from how the team was doing when Gregg was playing for them. The offense was abysmal in every facet. The defense couldn't produce takeaways and couldn't stop too many offenses from matriculating the ball down the field, and quarterback Lynn Dickey, after an amazing 1983 season, was looking like a shell of his former self through the first half of the 1984 season. This year was shaping up to be a train wreck, and at least initially, was shaping up to be one of the worst seasons in the long and storied history of the Packers franchise. So the last thing you need in a situation like that is any more drama, right? The last thing you need when you're already bad is to add more fuel to the fire, especially when said fuel seemingly comes out of nowhere and doesn't seem to make a ton of sense based on what was going on. Well, that was not the case with the Packers at all. Far from it. Because on October 15th, 1984, the Packers played the Denver Broncos on the road on Monday Night Football, and in front of a national television audience, not only embarrassed themselves during the game, but embarrassed themselves after the game, thanks to a feud with the worldwide leader in sports, this network right here, ESPN. No, ESPN was not televising the game. They wouldn't get the rights to NFL games until 1987, and wouldn't get the rights to Monday Night Football until 2006. By this point in 1984, ESPN was still an upstart and struggling network that wasn't even airing all sports, and was airing business and finance shows just to stay afloat. But they played a huge part to play in this drama, I'll put it that way. Because after the game between the Packers and the Broncos concluded, one ESPN reporter got into it with Green Bay Packers starting quarterback Lynn Dickey under a, shall we say, bizarre set of circumstances. As for whose side you're on, well, it's definitely a bit of a sticky situation. Because this is the story behind what happened after the game, and the bizarre drama, feud, and controversy between ESPN and the Green Bay Packers. Before I talk about the actual incident in question, and the argument that you can make for both sides of the coin, we need some context to understand how the game itself was going, and how Green Bay's season was going that led to this confrontation in the first place. It's October 15th, 1984. It's week 7 of the NFL season, and as we're nearing the halfway point, we've got an interconference battle on our hands under the lights on Monday Night Football, in front of a national television audience on ABC, between the Green Bay Packers and the Denver Broncos. For the Packers, as already mentioned, this has been a rough season for them, and that's putting it lightly. And it didn't look on paper like things were going to get any easier for them entering this game against the Broncos, seeing as not only were the Broncos one of the best teams in football, leading the AFC West with a 5-1 record, and boasting the best defense in the league through 6 weeks, having allowed just 78 points, or a mere 13 points per game, but seeing as you can tell from these shots of the stadium on this day, the weather was going to be absolutely brutal. It should not be snowing like this in mid-October. It really should not be. But Denver was going to be a cold, winter wonderland on this Monday night that the Packers were going to have to find some way to overcome to have any shot whatsoever at turning their season around. And a big reason why the Packers were even in this mess in the first place was because of the play of this man right here, Lynn Dickey. I've talked about Dickey before on this channel in his career, so if you want to learn more about him, you can do so by clicking the card in the upper right corner. Dickey was coming off of quite possibly the best year of his entire career in 1983. The Packers went 8-8, and the only reason they were that good in the first place wasn't because of their defense, which ranked 26th out of 28 teams, or because of great coaching, seeing as Bart Starr, who you can learn more about by clicking the card in the upper right corner, was abysmal and had no idea what he was doing. The only reason they were that good was because of their 5th-ranked offense led by Dickey, who led the league with 4,458 passing yards, 32 touchdowns, and 9.2 yards per pass attempt. Even though the Packers didn't make the playoffs or have a winning record, he got some votes for MVP and AP Offensive Player of the Year in the process. That's how good he was. He was the most important piece in the Packers not being a laughingstock that season, because he was single-handedly carrying that offense and that team at times. But just 1 year later in 1984, and man, as you can see from these lowlights you've been watching, how things had changed dramatically. The Packers offense that had a quarterback last year that was firing on all cylinders was doing nothing. It was like everything changed overnight, as a big reason why the Packers were 1-5 through 6 games was because their passing offense was nothing short of atrocious. Through the first 6 games of the season, Dickey had just 6 touchdown passes, meaning that he was on pace to throw for half of the touchdowns that he did the previous year. He had thrown for just 1,024 yards, or 170 per game. This meant that he was on pace to throw for about 40% fewer yards than he did in 1983. He threw more interceptions than touchdowns, having a touchdown-to-interception ratio less than 1. The Packers were held to 7 points or less in 3 of their first 6 games, all of which Dickey got the start for. And in one particularly embarrassing outing, a 20-6 loss on the road to the Dallas Cowboys, Dickey completed 31% of his passes and had a passer rating of 18.7, which is worse than if he did nothing but spike the ball into the ground on every single play. Not only was it a rough season for the Packers, but it was a rough season for Dickey, and that's putting it lightly. And the bad news for the Packers and for Dickey was that these struggles were going to continue during this game against Denver, as when all was said and done, in front of a national television audience, the Packers lost by a final score of 17-14. How bad was this game? Well, this game had to have something that might never be topped, as this might be, no exaggeration, the worst start that any team has ever had to a game in the history of the sport. The Packers got the ball to start the game off. On the very first play from scrimmage, the Packers fumbled the football, and Steve Foley returned it 22 yards to the house for a touchdown to make it 7-0 Broncos. Then, the Packers got the ball on the ensuing kickoff for drive number 2. On the second play from scrimmage, the Packers once again fumbled the football, and once again, the Broncos recovered it and returned it 27 yards to the house for a touchdown. We were just 30 seconds into the game. The Broncos had not even had a possession on offense yet, and the Packers were down 14-0. And that kind of set the tone for the entire night. Green Bay fumbled 7 times, turned it over 5 times, and racked up just 74 yards rushing in these conditions on 2.8 yards per carry. It was an embarrassing start and a bad loss that further put a dent in what had been a horrible season for the Packers thus far, and a horrible start for head coach Forrest Gregg. So after the game, the talk was, naturally, about how the Packers once again lost and kept their awful losing streak alive, which was now sitting at 6 games. You had reporters from stations and networks all across the country at this game, seeing as this was on Monday Night Football and got the national spotlight. And one of these reporters happened to be from ESPN. The plan for the report was simple. The reporter would do a live shot from the room where the press conferences were being held, would talk about the game, and in particular, talk about the offensive struggles of the Packers all season and in this game, which made sense on paper, seeing as the Packers fell behind 14-0 due to 2 fumbles on the first 2 plays by their running backs, seeing as the Packers turned it over 5 times, not including a turnover on downs on 4th and inches, and seeing as the Packers didn't score a single point in the first half. There's nothing so far about this story that seems even the slightest bit unusual or controversial. We see something like this all the time. A reporter does a live shot for a show, the reporter talks about the game and what happened in the press conference, and that's that. This is a non-issue. And as is traditional and extremely commonplace in the industry, the reporter was practicing the live shot and was practicing everything that he was going to say before he got on camera for real. Seeing as you're not going to be looking down at the script, since your eyes will be on the camera, and you want to have as much memorized as possible. But that is where things went completely haywire. That's where things went completely off the rails. And that's when this man right here, Green Bay Packers quarterback Lynn Dickey, had a major problem, deciding to make a mountain out of a molehill, primarily out of frustration with yet another loss and yet another offensive struggle by his team. A big part of the report was the fact that the Packers, after having one of the best offenses in football the year before, were terrible on that side of the ball this year, and how quarterback Lynn Dickey, who was a candidate for MVP the year before, was nearly halfway through this season and had thrown more interceptions than touchdowns, not even close to the pace he was at last year. And Dickey was about 30 feet away from the ESPN reporter who was practicing his live shot, and was prepping everything he was going to say before he went on the air. Maybe it was the fact that Dickey had incredible ears. Maybe it was the fact that the ESPN reporter was talking somewhat loudly. Maybe it was a combination of both. However, Dickey could hear everything that this reporter was saying before he was about to go on the air, and before the cameras were rolling. And Dickey was having none of that. He yelled at the ESPN reporter to be quiet. The reporter did not respond to that. From all accounts, I don't think he knew that Dickey was talking to him. He never addressed him by his name or by his station. Plus, as a reporter, there are going to be distractions with outside noises all the time, so you have to tune them out, because you're never going to get the report in perfect sound and ideal conditions, as there will always be background noise. But the second time, oh man, the reporter heard the wrath of Dickey, and knew for sure that he was being talked to by the Packers' starting quarterback. And Dickey, incredibly frustrated at having to hear this, yelled at the reporter and said, "Why don't you go out in the snow and say that stuff? We don't need to hear that over and over and over again." Translation: you try playing offense and throwing a football on that. We know we haven't had the best season offensively. You don't need to say it. I don't want to hear it. Get away from me. And just like that, as if an already tumultuous season couldn't get any crazier, you had the starting quarterback of the Green Bay Packers feuding with the reporter from ESPN for practicing a live report about the game. Now, there's 2 ways that you can look at this. On one hand, it is very easy to side with ESPN on this one. All you had here was a reporter who was trying to do his job. He wasn't speaking directly to this man right here, Lynn Dickey. He wasn't trying to provoke anyone. He wasn't up in his face. He was 30 feet away. He wasn't instigating a situation. All this reporter was doing was practicing his live shot before he was about to go on the air, which, let's call it for what it is incredibly common practice. I did broadcasting for many years, and I always took time to practice my live shot and make sure everything sounded and looked the way that I needed it to. Heck, even with these videos, before I hit the record button for the on-camera part where the helmet case is behind me, since I do that part without looking at a script in front of me, since you would need to see my computer screen because of the glare of the helmet cases, and because I would just look at that instead of the camera, I practice a few times and go through it just to make sure it's all good. The reporter on the surface did nothing wrong here, and it's not like this segment was about something factually incorrect. It's an undeniable fact that through the first 7 games of the season, the Packers were 1-6 and have thrown just 8 touchdown passes, which is hard to ignore for a plethora of reasons. It's hard to ignore this flaw when the Packers at 1-6 have the worst record in the NFC. It's hard to ignore this flaw when the Packers have the worst scoring offense in the NFC, having scored just 113 points, or barely over 16 points per game, with that average going down after this loss against the Broncos. It's hard to ignore this flaw when there was a 3-game stretch at one point where the Packers were averaging an abysmal 101 yards per game through the air. It's hard to ignore this flaw when the Packers are comfortably in the bottom half of just about every major passing category through 7 games. And it's especially hard to ignore this flaw when you see what's happening down in Miami, where Dan Marino is torching the league at a historic rate and is doing things in the passing game that were never thought to be possible, while Green Bay's offense is stuck in the mud and is playing a completely different sport. This isn't really nitpicking. It's not as though the reporter was saying a report about something that Dickey said that was erroneous or was trying to create drama. This was entirely factual. The offense was doing poorly so far, and the passing game was a big part of that. Plus, where else was the reporter going to do this live shot and practice? It's not as though there was anywhere else in the stadium he could realistically go. You want to do the practice for the live shot in the same environment they were actually going to do the live shot in, so that you can make sure the camera settings are good, so you know where to look, and so you can become familiar with the place. And this live shot was being done in the room where press conferences were held, which is fairly traditional. It's not as though the reporter was standing right next to Lynn Dickey's locker and was doing this. He was doing this in a designated space designed for reporters. It's like blaming someone for farting when they're in a bathroom stall. So in many ways, the ESPN reporter was entirely in the right here to do what he did, and Lynn Dickey was entirely out of line to call him out and provoke him. On the other hand, it's also very easy to side with Lynn Dickey on this one, because Dickey was not the reason that the Packers lost this game. In fact, as you can tell from these highlights, he actually played extremely well on this day, especially in these conditions. This seemed to be a case of ESPN and its reporter trying to push a narrative that, at least on this day, did not exist. If anything, offensively, Dickey was the only reason that the Packers had a fighting chance at winning. None of the yards or stats were accumulated in garbage time, so all of these numbers were completely legitimate. At the end of the day, Dickey went 27 for 37, completing 73% of his passes for 371 yards and a touchdown, while posting a passer rating of 102.4. He did it on long passes, and he did it in absolutely brutal conditions where the snow was coming down for the entire game, making it really tough to throw the football. Heck, his counterpart, John Elway, only had a passer rating of 48.1, and the Broncos, despite throwing the ball a lot, had just 101 yards of passing all game. No one's denying that this was a rough season for Dickey up until this point, but this game against the Broncos was the most passes he completed in a game this year, the highest completion percentage he had in a game this year, the highest yards per attempt he had in a game this year, and the highest passer rating he had in a game this year, and the first time all season he was over 100. It was also just 13 yards shy of his outing against the San Diego Chargers from a week ago for his highest total in passing yards. So even though the report may have been factual, it's not really factual. I'm just going to throw out a hypothetical example to further illustrate how a story like this didn't seem appropriate or seem to make any sense. Imagine if there's a baseball team, let's say the New York Yankees, and they're really struggling this season. They're below 500, they're falling apart, and nothing seems to be going well or working. And a big part of that is because their plate discipline is terrible, and they're striking out more times than any team in baseball. You do a live story at Yankee Stadium after a loss, and talk about how their plate discipline is absolutely killing them, as they have more strikeouts than any other team. However, you do this story after the Yankees lost the game 10-9, where they only struck out twice all day and didn't strike out for the final 7 innings of the game, and the 2 strikeouts they did have were with no one on base. Like, yes, the Yankees have had trouble with plate discipline, But doing a story like that as your post-game report after they only struck out twice all game seems incredibly misleading, and like you're trying to push a narrative that on this day did not exist. If you listen to that report, you would think that the reason the Yankees lost was because of their poor plate discipline and strikeouts. But that was actually the one thing keeping them in the game. That was not a problem on this day. And the same thing applies here with the man you've been watching this whole time, quarterback Lynn Dickey. If you listen to the ESPN report, you would think that the reason the Packers lost was because he played poorly. But in reality, he was the one thing offensively that was working. When your quarterback has a passer rating above 100 in snowy weather and does everything he's supposed to do and then some, and you do a report about how bad the passing game is, yeah, I can also see where Dickey's coming from. It's a complicated situation, to say the least, where both sides presumably have a valid point to make. Amazingly enough, after the game between these two teams behind me right here, the Green Bay Packers would rebound and would actually have quite a solid season. They lost the following week to the Seattle Seahawks to drop to 1-7, but they somehow won 7 of their final 8 games and got everything going, as they ended the year 8-8, missing the playoffs by just 1 game. And Green Bay's offense under Lynn Dickey, which was struggling heavily before, went from the worst offense in the NFC to the 4th best when all was said and done. Again, they only missed the playoffs by 1 game. If only they could take back how the game started against the Broncos, where they turned it over twice on the first 2 plays and allowed 2 touchdowns on 2 fumbles in 40 seconds. Can't blame Lynn Dickey for that one. So that raises the ultimate question that I would love to know your thoughts on in the comments. Whose side are you on? Are you on the side of the ESPN reporter, thinking that he wasn't provoking anyone, was just trying to do his job in the designated space assigned to him in the media room, that he was telling the facts, and thinking that Lynn Dickey should not have attacked him verbally for just practicing his live report? Or are you on the side of Dickey in that the reporter should not have been doing that, and that the report was entirely misleading to how the game actually went? Whoever you want to side with is up to you. But if you were on the side of ESPN, then it's very clear that in your mind, when it came to that reporter and his treatment of him, Lynn Dickey was being a real, well, you can fill in the blank on that one. Get your official Jaguar Gear 9 merchandise by going to jj9shop.com, and be sure to like and subscribe, as it really helps the channel out a lot. Join me every Wednesday night where we'll play NFL Trivia for cash prizes at 9 p.m. Eastern over on Twitch. To learn more about the history of college football, subscribe to Jaguar Gator 8. To learn more about the history of Major League Baseball, subscribe to Jaguar Gator 7. Also, special thanks to all of our Patreon supporters for helping out the channel. Your support is greatly appreciated. See how you can become a patron and request future video topics in the description below.